He is a beast. That is exactly what you are looking at when you see Ray Price on one side of the screen and Les Boyd on the other. Two men from the same brutal era of rugby league. Two men who played through a time when the game was raw, physical, and unforgiving. Old school footy built legends out of toughness. It rewarded the hard men who refused to back down. And the fans who lived through that era still talk about it like nothing else has ever come close. But in 2024, an old wound cracked open again. Daryl Broman came out and publicly criticised Boyd being inducted into the Hall of Fame. And just like that, 4 decades of simmering tension boiled right back to the surface. People started asking the same question all over again. Why does the name Les Boyd still stir up this much heat? And if you want more wild old school footy stories like this one, use the hype feature and give this video some hype right now. It helps a ton. The answer is not simple. Boyd's Hall of Fame biography calls him a tough and uncompromising forward. His resume is elite, representative honours, big finals, decades of recognition. But running alongside all of that is a disciplinary record that is hard to ignore. Serious alleged foul play, limited in-game punishment, then escalation through complaints, video review, and judiciary action. That pattern showed up more than once. And the players who shared a field with him had very real reasons to account for him, not always because of documented fear in their own words, but because Boyd's presence on a football field carried a weight that went beyond normal intimidation. This is the story of 11 legends who saw it up close. Number 11, Graham Eadie. Graham Eadie was one of the most dangerous fullbacks Manly Warringah ever produced. His Hall of Fame biography confirms he was a leading figure in that club's success, right through to 1983. Here is the part that makes his story different from everyone else on this list. Eadie did not face Les Boyd from the other side of the field. He stood next to him in the same dressing room. Boyd's own Hall of Fame biography confirms he joined Manly after leaving Western Suburbs and played in the 1982 Grand Final for the club. That means Eadie and Boyd were teammates during the most controversial stretch of Boyd's Australian career. Now, there is no official quote from Eadie saying Boyd was unpredictable or difficult to manage. The sources do not support that specific claim. But ask yourself this. When your teammate is the kind of player who keeps ending up in front of the judiciary, who keeps generating headlines for all the wrong reasons, what does that do to the people around him? Eadie saw it from inside the tent. He knew what Boyd was capable of. And that knowledge, living alongside it every week at training and on game day, tells its own story. Number 10, Les Johns. Les Johns is the most honest inclusion on this list. His Hall of Fame biography places his peak career firmly in the 1960s, Grand Final in 1967, Kangaroo Tours in 1963, 1964, and 1967. Boyd did not debut until 1976. Any direct on-field rivalry between these two men is highly unlikely, and the sources do not support one. So why is Johns here? Because his story works as a bridge. Johns represented what rugby league looked like before it started tipping into the kind of chaos Boyd would come to symbolise. By the time Boyd was making headlines for gouging charges and lengthy suspensions, Johns was watching from outside the game. Legends from that earlier era had a clear view of how drastically the culture was shifting. Johns saw what the sport used to look like. Boyd became part of what it was turning into. That contrast earns him a place in this conversation. Number 9, Eric Grother Sr. Eric Grother Sr. was not easy to intimidate. His Hall of Fame profile uses the word intimidating to describe him. He was a wrecking ball on the wing for Parramatta throughout the 1980s. That context matters because you cannot honestly say Boyd made Grother shrink. The sources do not support that. What the sources do support is this. Grother's career at Parramatta ran directly through the same era when Boyd was collecting charges and bans at Manly and Western Suburbs. Their clubs clashed repeatedly. There is no verified account of Boyd targeting Grother on kick returns with knees or forearms. That specific claim is not in the reliable record, but two physically powerful men, bitter rival clubs crossing paths in a competition that was not shy about confrontation, tells its own story. Grother was tough enough to give it back, but even tough players in that era had to adjust their approach when Boyd was on the field. Not because they were scared, because Boyd's record made him unpredictable in a way that demanded awareness. Number 8, Wayne Pearce. Wayne Pearce was everything Boyd was not in terms of public image. His Hall of Fame biography highlights him as a fitness pioneer, a professional, and a model forward who helped drag the game into a more disciplined era. And that contrast with Boyd is sharp. Pearce and Boyd were both elite New South Wales forwards at the same time. They wore the same jersey in representative football. But where Pearce was building a reputation as a leader, Boyd was accumulating charges, bans, and controversy. The sources do not provide any direct link between Pearce and a specific fear of Boyd. His official bio does not mention Boyd in that context. but consider what it means to compete alongside a player whose disciplinary record keeps threatening to derail everything around him. Pearce stood for the professional standard. Boyd, through his actions, kept challenging that standard. Their overlap in elite New South Wales football is well documented. The contrast is undeniable. Number 7, Tom Raudonikis. Tom Raudonikis was as hard as anyone who ever played the game. His Hall of Fame biography hammers that point home. He was the heartbeat of the Western Suburbs Magpies and the engine of the Fibros versus Silvertails rivalry that defined that era of Sydney Rugby League. Boyd played for Western Suburbs too, and the accounts of that Fibros versus Silvertails culture describe a rivalry deliberately fueled by intimidation and physical confrontation. Manly targeted West's players. West's targeted Manly players. Boyd was part of that environment, both as a participant and as a focal point for some of the roughest exchanges. A first-hand lecture account of that rivalry describes incidents involving Boyd in a context of institutionalized aggression between the clubs. The honest version of this story is not that Raudonikis feared Boyd. It is that both men were hard men in a rivalry specifically designed to be brutal. They were not enemies in the way the title suggests. They were products of the same violent culture, but that culture is exactly why Boyd's name still carries so much weight. Number 6, Steve Mortimer. Steve Mortimer was one of the great New South Wales halfbacks of the 1980s. His Hall of Fame biography notes his role in putting passion into the Blues jersey and his importance to Australian representative football. He and Boyd were contemporaries who appeared in representative football at the same time, but the sources do not support any specific claim that Boyd played indiscriminately toward Mortimer, or that Mortimer ever expressed fear of Boyd in any verifiable way. There is no interview, no official account, no documented incident tying Mortimer to a Boyd-specific experience of danger. What can be said is simpler. Mortimer was a halfback. Halfbacks in that era were targets. The game was physical in ways the modern version simply is not. And Boyd was one of the players in that competition whose charges and bans made it clear he was willing to go further than most. Playing in the same representative setup as Les Boyd meant existing in the shadow of his reputation. For a halfback managing the game from the base, that kind of shadow had real weight. Number 5, Gene Miles. Gene Miles was built differently. His Hall of Fame page describes him as immensely powerful, dangerous, and a rare combination of size and speed. He was a Queensland enforcer in the most literal sense. And in the 1983 State of Origin series, he was on the field the night everything changed. Miles played for Queensland in Game 1 at Lang Park. Boyd was playing for New South Wales. The West Archive account confirms that during that match, no one was sent off or sin-binned. The only immediate action was a penalty. And then Broman walked off with a broken jaw. Miles was there. He saw what happened in real time. His official biography does not tie his mindset to any survival instinct when Boyd was nearby. But being on that field the night the Broman incident happened is connection enough. The ripple from that match travelled far and wide. Miles felt it from the Queensland side. Number 4, Wally Lewis. Wally Lewis is Origin football. His Hall of Fame biography frames him as the defining figure of that interstate rivalry through the 1980s. The king, the general, the man Queensland built their identity around, but the sources do not provide a verified link where Lewis singled Boyd out as especially frightening or said anything on record about Boyd being the most dangerous man he faced. That specific claim is not substantiated. What is substantiated is that Lewis was at the centre of the Origin Wars during the exact period when Boyd was building his controversial reputation. Lewis played for Queensland, Boyd played for New South Wales. They lined up against each other in the most contested and physically hostile series in Australian Rugby League history. The 1983 series in particular was played at a level of intensity that the record describes clearly. Boyd's actions in Game 1 of that series sent shockwaves through both camps. You cannot say Lewis had to keep his head on a swivel because of Boyd specifically, but you can say Lewis competed at the peak of a rivalry that Boyd helped make more dangerous. And Lewis was too smart and too composed a player to not account for a man with Boyd's record every single time they met. Number 3, Ray Price. Ray Price is one half of the thumbnail you clicked on. His Hall of Fame biography calls him one of the most relentless players ever to play the game. The nickname Mr. Perpetual Motion was not given lightly. He was the kind of player who never switched off, never took a play off, and never gave an opponent a moment of rest. Now, the record does not contain a verified quote from Price saying Boyd was consequence-free or uniquely dangerous in a way that got inside his head. The sources do not give us that, but Price is in this video for a reason that goes deeper than a quote. When the thumbnail puts Ray Price next to Les Boyd, it is making a statement about the era. Even the toughest, most relentless players in the competition had to be aware of Boyd, not because toughness meant nothing, but because Boyd's pattern, the incidents, the charges, the bans, the Broman injury, all of it pointed to a player who operated outside the normal rules of engagement. Price played within the game's hardest edges, Boyd kept pushing past them, and even Mr. Perpetual Motion had to factor that in. Number 2, Peter Sterling. Peter Sterling is one of the finest players this country ever produced. His Hall of Fame profile confirms his role as Parramatta's commanding playmaker and a central figure of the 1980s era. He was the kind of halfback who saw the game 3 plays ahead, precise, intelligent, clinical. Now here is something important that the record forces us to say clearly. Sterling and Boyd were actually on the same side in Game 1 of the 1983 State of Origin series. Boyd played for New South Wales. So did Sterling. That means you cannot honestly say Boyd was hunting Sterling down in that match. They were teammates. That internal consistency matters. And it actually makes the story more interesting, because if even your own teammate in Origin football was capable of breaking an opponent's jaw and walking away with only a penalty given in the moment, what does that tell you about the kind of player you are sharing a field with? Sterling's official profile does not include a sourced quote calling Boyd frightening, but Boyd's Manly years overlapped directly with Sterling's Parramatta prime. Their clubs clashed repeatedly, and a halfback as smart as Peter Sterling absolutely understood what Boyd's reputation meant every time those two clubs met. You do not get to that level of the game without doing your homework on the most dangerous men across from you. Number 1, Darryl Brohman. This is where the story stops being about reputation and starts being about documented fact. Darryl Brohman is the only person on this entire list where the evidence is rock solid, multi-source, and impossible to argue with. On the 7th of June 1983, in Game 1 of the State of Origin series at Lang Park, Les Boyd broke Darryl Brohman's jaw. Brohman left the field. According to the West's archive account, no one was sent off. No one was sin-binned. The only in-game action was a penalty. Boyd's own retrospective account, included in the West's archive, states he knew immediately that Brohman was hurt and that he later went to the dressing room to apologize. Boyd's Hall of Fame biography records the disciplinary outcome plainly. He received a lengthy suspension for breaking Brohman's jaw in an Origin clash at Lang Park. The exact length of the ban is disputed across sources. Some reports cite 9 months. The NRL Hall of Fame biography and other official accounts state 12 months. The records disagree on the number, but every source agrees it was a long ban. And then in 2024, when Boyd was inducted into the Hall of Fame, Brohman came out publicly and criticized it. ABC News reported that Brohman noted the jaw-breaking incident and that he had later attempted to sue Boyd, with the matter ending in an out-of-court settlement. ESPN reported the same. More than 40 years later, the bitterness was still there. That is not folklore. That is not clickbait. That is a man who had his jaw broken in the most watched rugby league match in Australia, watched the man responsible get inducted into the sport's highest honour, and felt the need to speak up again. Darryl Brohman is not just number 1 on this list. He is the reason this list exists. And here is what ties all 11 names together. Boyd's career did not just create one controversial incident, it created a pattern. In 1978, the Battle of Lidcombe was so physical that the New South Wales Rugby League used video evidence after the fact to charge players. Boyd was charged with eye gouging. He was suspended, fined, and legal proceedings followed. In 1983, the Brohman incident happened with no immediate send-off and only a penalty in the moment, forcing the league to act through complaints and video review afterward. In 1984, Boyd returned from suspension and was involved in another gouging allegation involving hooker Billy Johnstone. The referee did not send him off at the time. The club initially did not progress a complaint. It fell to league general manager John Quayle himself to cite Boyd after watching video. Johnstone refused to answer questions at the hearing. The result was a 15-month ban that, according to official records cited by historian David Middleton, effectively ended Boyd's career in Australia. 3 separate incidents. 3 times where in-game control was not enough. 3 times where the league had to go back through video and complaints to get to a result. That is the real story of why Boyd became a symbol, not just of toughness, but of a game that was desperately trying to manage the violence it had allowed to grow. So was every man on this list truly terrified of Les Boyd? The honest answer is no, not in a way that can be proven by quotes or official records for 10 of the 11. Several were his teammates in the very match used to anchor the fear narrative. You cannot claim he hunted them down in a game they played together. But what this list does capture is something real. 11 legends who existed in the same era, the same competition, the same brutal culture that Boyd helped define. They all had reason to know who he was. And for one of them, the reason was not a reputation or a vibe or a pattern in a record. It was a broken jaw on a June night in Brisbane that took 40 years and a Hall of Fame induction to stop hurting. The game has changed. Player safety is front and center now in ways it never was in the 1970s and 1980s. Video review does not just happen after the fact. The judiciary acts faster, the protections are stronger, and the sport is better for it. But the stories from that era still matter, not because they should be glorified, but because they show us where the sport came from and remind us why the changes were worth making. Let us know in the comments who you think belongs on a list like this. Like the video if you made it this far, and subscribe so you never miss a story from the era when footy was as raw as it gets. He's a monster. That's what the legends say when they talk about David Cement Gillespie. But it's not the kind of monster you see coming. It's the kind that changes the way you think about pain, about fear, and about what it means to be physically broken by another human being inside a rugby league field. This is the story of how one man, playing from 1984 to 1997, across the Balmain Tigers and Manly Warringah Sea Eagles, became the most feared defender of his entire decade. Not because he was the loudest or the dirtiest, but because he was quiet, precise, surgical, and absolutely ruthless. The legend of cement didn't come from nowhere. It came from a generation that understood defense differently than we do today. It came from an era when physicality wasn't just encouraged in rugby league, it was the foundation. It was the language of the game. Defense was respected. Attackers were expected to earn their meters through sheer determination. But inside that brutal landscape, there's a story that needs to be told honestly, because what David Gillespie did goes deeper than just being tough. He weaponized his body. He turned his shoulders into instruments of pain. He turned silence into terror. He turned the simple act of tackling an opponent into a statement about who controlled the field. And if you love these old school NRL stories, hit the hype feature and give this video some hype. Because what we're about to break down is why this man's name still makes former players uncomfortable when you bring it up at dinners. This is why coaches wanted him. This is why opponents feared him. Let's start with the one person who might matter the most when you're talking about how brutal someone really was. Number 7 on this list is Steve Blocker Roach. In the 1989 Grand Final, one of the most physically grueling matches in the entire history of the sport, something happened that people still talk about. Roach was there, he was on the field with Gillespie, and he remembers something specific. He remembers the sound. In a stadium filled with thousands of screaming fans, with all the noise and chaos of a grand final, Gillespie hit somebody. And that hit was so loud, so forceful, that you could hear the bone-on-bone contact from 20 meters away. Think about that for a second. 20 meters. In a packed stadium filled with roaring people and noise, that's not just a tackle. That's not just physicality. That's a transfer of energy so massive that it cut through everything else happening around it. Blocker Roach said you could hear it. The crowd noise faded. The commentary faded. The chaos of the match seemed to pause. And then that one sound, the sound of impact, the sound of collision, the sound that made everyone remember what they were watching. That's the sensory experience of facing David Gillespie. That's what his violence felt like. That's what separates a normal tackle from a Gillespie tackle. Most defenders hope to stop the progress. Gillespie made sure everyone knew about it. Number 6 is Brad Fittler. Fittler is a legend himself. He's a man who played at the highest level. He's tough. He's been through wars on the field. He's faced the best defenders in the game. But when Fittler talks about Gillespie, he uses language that matters. He calls Gillespie a physical wall, not just a defender, not just someone who could tackle. A physical wall. Something immovable, something that changes the landscape of a field, and then he says something that really tells you everything. Fittler said that a hit from cement could make a pro player second-guess their career choices. Let that sink in. Not second-guess the next play, not second-guess the next carry, not even second-guess the next contact. Second-guess their entire career. Fittler is talking about the kind of physical trauma that makes you question whether you want to do this job anymore, whether you want to keep getting hit like that, whether it's worth the pain and the suffering, whether a career in professional rugby league is something you're willing to sacrifice your body for. That's the negative angle of what Gillespie built. He didn't just tackle people, he made them reconsider their life choices. He didn't just stop progress. He made players rethink their entire path. Number 5 is Matthew Johns. Johns is a playmaker. He's a 5'8", one of the most creative and intelligent positions in rugby league. A playmaker is supposed to see the field, find gaps, find opportunities, orchestrate the attack. Playmakers use vision and skill and intelligence. But Matthew Johns talks about genuine terror, real terror, the kind that affects how you think and how you move. He describes the moment when Gillespie decided to charge out of the line. John says that Gillespie's eyes had this coldness to them. Not anger, not passion, not the look of a man who was trying to prove something. Just coldness, empty, calculated. And Johns understood what that meant immediately. It meant the collision was inevitable. No matter what footwork you had, no matter how much side-to-side movement you could produce, it didn't matter. Gillespie was coming, and you were going to get hit. That understanding, that knowledge, that anticipation of pain destroys everything about how a playmaker operates. A playmaker who is looking at Gillespie is not looking for the gap in the defense. A playmaker who sees Gillespie charging is not seeing the supporting runner outside him. He's seeing Gillespie. His mind is focused on survival, not creation. His body is tense, not loose and flowing. The anticipation of pain neutralizes the opposition's entire creative system. That's psychological warfare dressed up as defense. That's using violence as a strategic weapon. Number 4 is Benny Elias. Elias was Gillespie's teammate at Balmain. Elias was the hooker, the leader of the team from the middle of the field. The hooker is the quarterback in many ways, calling plays and orchestrating the forward pack. And when Elias talks about playing alongside Gillespie, he uses a phrase that became famous in rugby league circles. Elias said that playing with cement made the entire team feel 6 inches taller. 6 inches? That's not a small thing. That's not just psychological feel-good talk. That's a massive shift in confidence. That's a massive psychological transformation. Elias wasn't just saying Gillespie was good at his job. He was saying Gillespie's presence fundamentally changed how his team felt about themselves. It changed their confidence. It changed their willingness to take risks. It changed the way they approached the opposition. And here's the thing that really matters. Elias joked that he felt safer with Gillespie on the field than he would have felt with a professional bodyguard standing next to him. Think about that. A professional bodyguard is trained specifically to protect people. That's their job. But Elias felt more secure with Gillespie. In the chaos and violence of scrum and ruck time in the 1980s and 1990s, the hooker is often targeted. The opposition forwards throw cheap shots. They make things difficult. They try to soften you up. But with Gillespie in the pack, every single one of those forwards knew what would happen if they went after Elias. Gillespie would deliver surgical retribution. They would be dealt with. Swift, clean, effective. That knowledge, that protection, gave Elias the freedom to operate. It gave the whole team tactical freedom. It allowed the creative players to play attacking rugby without worrying about getting bushwhacked. That's the force multiplier effect. One man's brutality improves the performance of 13 other players. That's leverage. Number 3 is Paul Sirenen. Sirenen was also a teammate at Balmain. Sirenen had the privilege or the burden, depending on how you look at it, of watching Gillespie up close, watching him work, watching him execute his craft, and Sirenen provides the technical breakdown. Sirenen describes Gillespie's shoulders as granite blocks. Granite, not muscle, not power, granite blocks. The kind of dense, unyielding material that doesn't compress or give. Sirenen also talked about something more specific and more troubling. He talked about surgical ability, and he's talking about the sweet spot on an opponent's ribs. Gillespie had this ability, this technique, that looked almost practiced, almost refined through years of repetition to find exactly where he needed to hit. Not the outer ribs, not the broad areas where impact is distributed, the floating ribs, the solar plexus. These are vulnerable areas. They're exposed. They're not protected like the upper chest. And when you get a shoulder strike to these areas, from a man with granite block shoulders, a man who drives upward from a lower center of gravity, the physiological effect is immediate and devastating. The diaphragm collapses, the breath gets knocked out completely, the wind is gone in an instant. There's a moment of panic where you can't breathe, you can't think, you can't do anything but gasp, and it can cause structural damage to the ribcage without being classified as a foul or reckless play. The negative angle here is absolutely critical. This wasn't luck. This wasn't accidentally finding these spots. Sironen's use of the word surgical means this was technique. Refined, practiced, deliberate, intentional. Gillespie was shorter than many of the massive props of that era, so he used this advantage. He drove his shoulder upward, he targeted the soft tissue and the bone of the torso with precision. Every single carry turned into a potential medical emergency. Every touch of the ball became a risk calculation. Opponents began to subconsciously seek to avoid contact with him because they knew what was coming. They knew the pain that awaited them. Number 2 is Gordon Tallis. Tallis is himself the raging bull. Tallis is known as one of the most aggressive forwards the game has ever seen. Tallis played the game with intensity and violence and pride. He brought noise to the field. He brought passion. He was a vocal presence. He made his impact known and felt. Tallis played the game his way. And when Tallis looks at the history of toughness in rugby league, when Tallis is asked who the gold standard is, he says David Gillespie. Not someone like him, but Gillespie. Tallis calls him the gold standard. Tallis recognizes in Gillespie something he respects. Something that matters in the sport. More than that, Tallis calls him the silent assassin, and Tallis explains why this matters so deeply. Tallis says that Gillespie never barked, he never yelled at opponents, he never engaged in psychological games with his mouth, he never initiated cheap fights or got involved in scrums for the sake of reputation. He was silent, and in the psychology of conflict, a silent opponent is far more terrifying than a vocal one. When someone is yelling at you, threatening you, running their mouth, you know their emotional state. You can read them. They're hot. They're emotional. They're in a state of arousal. But silence means control. It means discipline. It means the person is so confident, so sure of themselves, so certain of their abilities that they don't need to talk. They don't need to posture. They don't need to intimidate with words. They just act. They let their body do the talking. That's what Tallis respected. Tallis admired that Gillespie delivered devastating, clean hits. This is the critical nuance that separates Gillespie from other enforcers. Clean hits. This means Gillespie avoided the thuggery that got other players suspended. Players like Les Boyd got lengthy suspensions for elbows and reckless contact. Mark Geyer was known for controversy and dispute. John Donnelly was constantly at the judiciary answering for his conduct. But Gillespie stayed on the field. He remained on the field where he could continue to exert pressure. He remained a force throughout matches and throughout seasons. This professionalization of brutality made him a more effective weapon. Coaches like Bob Fulton didn't have to watch their defensive enforcer sit out games due to suspension. Gillespie could play every week, he could build on his reputation, he could be there match after match to deliver that controlled violence. And finally, number one, the testimonial that matters most of all. Wally Lewis. Wally Lewis was the king of rugby league. Lewis was the preeminent figure of that specific era. Lewis was a master of the game himself, and Lewis provided the most evocative description of what it felt like to face Gillespie. Lewis said being tackled by Gillespie felt like being struck by a swinging bag of wet concrete. Let's break that down because it's not just poetic. It's technically instructive. Wet concrete has weight, it has density, it has mass, but it's also in transition. It hasn't fully set yet. So when you swing it, when you move it, it moves with you. But at the exact moment of impact, it becomes rigid. It stops. It becomes unyielding. That's what Lewis is describing. Gillespie had the mobility to track you. He could follow agile playmakers. He could move around the field. But at the microsecond of impact, his body transformed. It became rigid. It became impenetrable. The kinetic energy of the tackle didn't disperse through his own body and get absorbed. It was directed entirely into you. For a player of Lewis's caliber, someone used to absorbing hits from the largest forwards of the era, the distinction of wet concrete implies a level of density that was abnormal. But here's where it gets darker. Lewis noted that Gillespie's intent was fundamentally different. Gillespie didn't just want to halt progress. He didn't just want to stop the ball carrier. He wanted to break the spirit. That phrase matters. Break the spirit. That's not about stopping the play. That's about psychological attrition. It's about using violence as a tool to wear down the opposition across the entire duration of a match. That's intentional. That's deliberate. That's the negative angle of Gillespie's career. Now, here's where we have to be honest about the context of that era. In that era, Gillespie was seen as a master of the game's most primal element. He wasn't a thug. He wasn't a dirty player. He was a professional. His specific skill set happened to be the delivery of physical and psychological trauma. He was able to deliver the most extreme form of violence allowed within the rules of that time. Compare him to his contemporaries and you see the difference. Other enforcers of the era got suspended, they got penalized, they made mistakes that kept them off the field. Gillespie stayed on the field, and that made him more dangerous as a weapon. He built his reputation on the precision of his impact, on the coldness of his execution. He understood that an enforcer's role was to systematically dismantle not just the physical resolve of an opponent, but their psychological resolve. The legacy question is interesting because it forces us to think about what we admire in sport and what we reject. Gillespie was the architectural master of specialized defensive violence. He understood kinetic intimidation at a level that few defenders ever have. He used psychological warfare as a primary tactic. Everything about his approach was designed to create fear, to create hesitation, to create pain. That's the negative angle of his story. His career was built on deliberate terror and pain. It was built on the destruction of the opponent's ability to compete. And by most measures of the era, he was the ultimate practitioner of this philosophy. But we also have to remember that the game moved forward. Modern rugby league has different standards. Shoulder-led charges that Tallis admired would now result in dismissal and lengthy suspensions. The surgical rib targeting that Sirenen described would now be scrutinized for dangerous contact. Intimidation is no longer viewed as a primary tactical objective. The focus has shifted to wrapping technique, to safe landing, to player safety. The persona of the silent assassin has been replaced by metrics around intensity and work rate. Yet despite all that change, the legend of Cement remains fixed permanently in NRL history. It remains because what he did was unprecedented at the time. The testimonies of his peers create an undeniable picture. Wally Lewis's wet concrete, Gordon Tallis's gold standard, Paul Sirenen's granite shoulders, Benny Elias's 6 inches taller, Matthew Johns' genuine terror, Brad Fittler's second guess your career, Steve Roach's sound from 20 meters away. These testimonies, these descriptions, they paint a portrait of a defender who understood that violence could be a tool, not just for stopping the ball, but for changing the way opponents thought about playing the game. The game has moved toward a more regulated future, and that's not a bad thing. Player safety matters. The long-term health of athletes matters. The shift away from pure intimidation as a tactic matters. We recognize now that there are better ways to defend. There are better ways to build a winning team. But when we look back at David Gillespie and we look at what he represented, we have to acknowledge his mastery. We have to acknowledge that in his era, he was the benchmark. He was the most feared defender of his decade. He was the one that other players feared. He was the one that changed how people approach the game. That's a legacy. If you love this breakdown of one of the toughest players rugby league has ever seen, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the legends who built this sport. Leave a comment down below about who you think was the toughest defender of that era, who was the most feared. Check out the other videos on the channel for more stories about the Warriors and the Warriors mentality that defined rugby league history. Thanks for watching and supporting the channel.
Played, I guess, professionally is the wrong word, but was it about 10 years that your rugby league career kind of spanned and then you got into coaching?
Took on its own life form from there. You know, 5 years with the Panthers, 2 years with Newtown, 3 years with the Bulldogs. I finished my career with 1 year at South, and I'd had a lot of injuries, a lot of bad injuries, long-term injuries in that time. So by the time I'd sort of finished at South in that year, I just decided I'd probably had enough playing.
He's a beast. That is what they said about Phil Gould, not behind closed doors, not in quiet whispers after a few drinks, right out loud, legends of the game. Men who had played in grand finals, men who had bled for Origin, men who had stared down the hardest opponents the NRL had ever put on a field. Decorated players, fearless competitors, men who had taken the biggest hits the game could deliver and come back for more. And yet, when you ask them what it truly felt like to be around Phil Gould, the answer comes back the same every single time. Something tightened in the chest. Something shifted deep in the gut. Not because he threatened them physically, not because he raised his voice or ruled through fear the way a bully does. It was something deeper than that. Something harder to explain and much harder to shake. These were not soft men. These were not rookies who crumbled under the slightest pressure. These were warriors, and Phil Gould made them feel like they were standing in front of a force they could not fully understand and could never afford to disappoint. Picture the scene. You are a young footballer. You have worked your whole life to get here. You are good. People have told you that your whole career. And then you walk into a room and Phil Gould is in it. He does not yell. He does not need to. He just looks at you, and somehow you already feel like you have let him down. That feeling stayed with the best players in this sport for decades. If this video is connecting with you, give it some hype right now. Hit that hype button and let it rip. Now let's get into why the greatest players in NRL history were genuinely terrified of this man. Here is the twist that changes everything. That fear did not come from cruelty. It did not come from chaos. It came from standards. It came from a level of expectation so consistently high that even elite men felt genuinely small standing beneath it. Every legend who has spoken about Phil Gould has said the same thing in different ways. He pushed them to places they would not have found on their own. The pressure was real. The intimidation was real. But so were the premierships. So were the Origin series. So were the careers that went from good to legendary because one man refused to accept anything less than everything. This is the story of how Phil Gould used fear, psychology, and an iron will to shape the greatest players this game has ever seen. We're going to walk through it player by player, method by method, from the most recent all the way back to the beginning. And to understand why all of this is so believable, you have to start with something that happened in 2025. Phil Gould had health scares, serious ones, the kind that would stop most men cold and send them retreating into rest and quiet reflection. And what did he do? He kept working. From a hospital bed, he was still at it, still sharp, still joking, still defiant, not performing toughness for the cameras, just being exactly who he has always been, as a man who refuses to stop. His physical engine had faltered, just as he always said bodies eventually do, but his will was completely untouched. For every player who had ever trained under him, heard him speak, or sat in one of his review sessions, that moment in 2025 was not surprising. It was confirmation. It set a standard that feels almost impossible to meet. When the man coaching you is operating on that level of obsession, even from a hospital bed, how do you ever feel like you have done enough? You do not. That is the point. To understand where that will came from, you have to go all the way back to 1979. Phil Gould was a young prodigy, talented, curious, already seeing the game differently from the players around him, and then his body broke. A catastrophic injury ended his playing career before it could become what everyone thought it would be. That event did not just change his career, it rewired him completely. The physical vulnerability he experienced in 1979 became the foundation of absolutely everything that followed. He learned early and he learned hard that the body can fail. It is not a matter of if, it is only ever a matter of when. No amount of talent protects you from that. no reputation, no potential. So he built something the body cannot touch. He built a philosophy, defense, mental toughness, and absolute will. When Phil Gould stepped into a coaching role, he was not just teaching football, he was teaching survival. And players entering his orbit were not just being coached in plays and patterns. They were being invited, whether they liked it or not, into a worldview where the coach is the sole judge of what counts as tough enough. That is a power imbalance unlike anything else in sport. It starts before a single whistle is blown. Penrith in the early 1990s was where it all came together. The Panthers became the laboratory. It was here that Gould first showed what tactical perfectionism could do to high-level athletes when it was applied with enough intelligence and enough sustained, unrelenting pressure. The methods he used there would define every room he ever walked into afterward. Think of it as a testing ground for the most sophisticated psychological operation rugby league had ever seen. The weapons were precise. Tactical demands, public scrutiny, psychological triggers, and a presence so heavy it bent the air around it. Every player who came through that environment carried the marks of it for the rest of their careers. Some called it a gift, some called it a scar, most called it both. The numbers below tell you exactly how it worked on each individual man. Number 7, Kane Evans. This one is recent, and it matters because it proves nothing has changed. When Gould stepped in as a consultant for the New Zealand Warriors, Kane Evans was in that room. Evans described the team address as pretty intense. That is a prop forward, a man built for collision, a man who has played the hardest minutes of the hardest game, using the word intense to describe someone just talking to him. Gould did not walk in with motivational cliches. He did not try to pump them up with sentiment. He came in with harsh statistics, cold, one-precise numbers that dismantled the squad's self-perception and left no room for comfortable illusions. Players walked out of that room fired up, but they were also wary. Fired up because the standard had been set so clearly. Wary because they now understood the gap between where they were and where he expected them to be. That combination, energy and unease at the same time, is a Gould signature. He has been producing it for 50 years, and he still produces it today. Number 6, Gary Freeman, the silent treatment. Of all the tools in Phil Gould's kit, this one might be the most psychologically damaging. Gary Freeman, a genuine legend of the game, experienced it directly. Gould could make a player feel completely invisible, not through argument or confrontation, just through absence. If you were no longer part of his long-term vision, or as you cease to exist in his world, no eye contact, no acknowledgement, nothing. For a professional athlete whose entire identity is built on being seen, on being valued, on mattering to the team, that kind of erasure is devastating. It is worse than being yelled at. Being yelled at means you are still worth the energy. Silence says something different. It says you are already gone. This extended into the commentary box. Colleagues at Nine reported that Gould could sit in complete silence for hours before a broadcast, not acknowledging anyone around him, not making eye contact, not offering so much as a nod, until the moment the on-air light came on. Ray Warren, who knew him as well as anyone in that environment, called him tripler. Not difficult, not moody, tripolar. The unpredictability, in being his best mate 1 minute and invisible to him the next, created a state of constant hypervigilance in everyone around him. You were always watching for the shift, always trying to read the room. That mental labor, that permanent low-level alertness is exhausting, and Gould never had to lift a finger to produce it. Number 5, Ben Ikin. Put yourself in this position. You are young, you have made it to State of Origin. This is the biggest stage in the game, and you walk into that camp and Phil Gould is running it. Ikin described that experience as overwhelming. He called Gould a master of the dark arts, a man whose command of a room left no space for a rookie's nerves. There was nowhere to hide. The room belonged to Gould from the moment he entered it. In an Origin camp, there is no slow build. There is no time for the gradual grind of club-level conditioning. Gould knew that, so he used high-impact psychological maneuvers instead. He had to get inside the heads of these players in days, not months. And he did it every time. For a young player like Ikin, that level of presence was not just intimidating, it was almost disorienting, like standing too close to something very large and very sure of itself. Number 4, Mark Geyer. Now here is where it gets complicated, because Geyer was not someone you would typically describe as easy to intimidate. He was the wild man, the enforcer, the player opponents genuinely feared, and Phil Gould could control him. Geyer himself admitted it. Gould was one of the very few men who could truly manipulate his aggression, and he did not do it by calming Geyer down or reining him in. Or he did it by redirecting him. He used psychological triggers to point that natural ferocity at specific tactical goals, like directing a river rather than trying to dam it. The result was devastating for opponents. but the cost to Gaia was real. The mental exhaustion of being managed that way, of having someone inside your mind pulling levers you did not even know you had, was more draining than the physical game itself. Gould did not just use Gaia's body. He used Gaia's psychology, and Gaia knew it. That knowledge that you are a piece on someone else's chessboard does something to a person, it stays with them. Number 3, Ryan Girdler. If you wanted to understand why Penrith in the early 1990s felt like a reign of terror, you had to hear it from Girdler. His accounts are clear and unflinching. The video review sessions were brutal. Indeed, Gould would sit the entire squad down and dissect mistakes in front of everyone. No softening, no private conversations, just precise, intelligent, surgical analysis of exactly how and why a player had failed. The dread of being singled out was constant, and the truly terrifying part was that Gould could always articulate it perfectly. He left no room for excuses, no defensive posturing, no "I didn't realize" or "I thought I was in position." He already knew everything. His intelligence in those sessions was not just impressive, it was a weapon. Players began monitoring their own performance through his anticipated lens even before the game started. They were not just playing for the result, they were playing to survive the review. That is a different kind of pressure, entirely. Number 2, Greg Alexander, captain of the 1991 Premiership side. A leader in every sense of the word. And yet the burden Alexander carried under Gould was immense. He was not just asked to lead his teammates. He was required to execute the Gould game plan with zero deviation. Not near zero. Zero. Any tactical error would be met with intense, surgical scrutiny. The fear of that review became more pressing than the fear of the opposition. Alexander experienced a specific kind of mental fatigue that went beyond what the physical game demands. Every decision on the field was a performance for an audience of one. Every choice carried the weight of Gould's anticipated judgment. That is anxious perfectionism at the highest level of sport. It is a state where the coach's standards are so deeply internalized that they operate even when the coach is not in the room. While Alexander was not just running a game plan, he was carrying it like a weight that never came off. Number 1, Brad Fittler, the most documented of them all. The love-intimidation duality that defines Gould's leadership is nowhere more visible than in his relationship with Fittler. Young Freddie felt the pressure of Gould's expectations in a way that went beyond football. In the Penrith environment, Gould was not viewed as a mentor or even as a coach. He was viewed as a deity. That is not an exaggeration, and it is not a metaphor. That is how it functioned psychologically. When you see someone as a deity, failure is not a setback, it is a moral transgression. Missing a tactical requirement did not feel like making a mistake. It felt like a betrayal of something sacred. Gould built that dynamic deliberately. He positioned himself as the holder of secret superior knowledge. A man who watched the game off the ball, who saw what others missed, who understood dimensions of the sport that were invisible to ordinary eyes. Players came to believe that success was only possible through him. And when you believe that, the threat of his disapproval becomes an existential risk. Not just to your career, to your sense of self. The tools Gould used in the Origin arena went even further. Former players have compared his oratory to Winston Churchill. His bedtime stories, told the night before a game, were designed as believable narratives that players would carry into their sleep. Themes of sacrifice and teammate love. His voice, the last authoritative sound in their minds before they faced the physical reality of the match. He also used cinema. He brought in the wall speech from A Few Good Men and laid it over the defensive line, giving the NSW players a metaphor so powerful that opponents were genuinely confused during games. Steve Walters heard NSW players shouting about the wall in the heat of battle and had no idea what was happening. Gould had overlaid a fictional high-stakes narrative onto the real game, and the players had absorbed it completely. They were not just defending a line. They were guarding something that mattered beyond the scoreboard. And when things went wrong, he could reverse the whole thing in minutes. After Game 1 of the 1994 series, a game he had spent weeks calling a must-win, Gould walked into a dressing room of defeated men and told them he had always secretly thought the second game was the most important one. Get your heads up. Whoever wins Game 2 wins the series. He moved the goalposts completely, relieved the guilt, redirected the focus, and they went on to win the series. That ability to lie convincingly, not for personal gain, but for the morale of his team, is at the heart of the dark arts. It is not manipulation for cruelty. It is manipulation for performance. In his later years, Gould traded the coach's whistle for what observers called a mobile phone wielded like a sword. His network expanded beyond dressing rooms into a world of billionaires, politicians, and media executives. David Gingle, the former CEO of Nine, said Gould was the most intimidating figure in the game due to his intelligence, not his title. His personal mantra, "Only the paranoid survive," informed everything. Now, he texted CEOs and officials into the early hours of the morning with what one observer called Tolstoy-like volumes of communication, leaving them exhausted just trying to keep up. He was never out of the loop. His influence was felt in every major decision in the sport. And yet, underneath all of this, there was something genuine. David Gillespie described him as a knock-around bloke who loves a drink and a punt and never forgets his players. Gould called Gillespie at 4:30 in the morning after he was left out of an Origin squad, called Robbie McCormick at 1 a.m. to congratulate him on a selection. Round-the-clock engagement that reinforces the obsession. Even his care is intimidating because it suggests a man who never sleeps and who expects the same level of dedication from everyone around him. When he speaks, even quietly, only players lean in because they know the weight behind the words. His turnaround of the Canterbury Bankstown Bulldogs from a broken and directionless club to a genuine top 4 team validated everything all over again. People watched it happen in real time and still struggled to fully explain it. Same principles as Penrith 30 years earlier. Homegrown talent, rejection of what he calls soft modern science, iron control of culture. The results still come, the fear still works. The legend is not nostalgia. It is current and it is proven. The legends were terrified of Phil Gould for one reason above all others. He could see their limits before they could. He could see the gap between who they were and who they needed to become. And he absolutely refused to let them stay comfortable in that gap. He pulled them into it. Yeah, he forced them to live there until it no longer felt like a gap at all. The fear was the pressure. The pressure was the tool, and the tool produced players who became immortal. That is the full picture of Phil Gould. Not a bully, not a tyrant, a man with an unbreakable will and the psychological sophistication to bend the minds of the greatest players this game has ever seen. Toward greatness they could not have reached alone. The body eventually falters. He always said that. It is the one thing you cannot argue with. But the will, once properly armored, remains untouched. For over 50 years, Phil Gould has been the living proof of that idea. And every single legend who ever feared him is the proof that it worked.